What happens when one moment of weakness threatens to unravel everything you've built? Will the truth bring us closer or tear everything apart? Stay with me as I tell you my story, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable tales. Also, let me know where you're watching. When my husband left for yet another business trip, the house felt impossibly silent. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the afternoon light play across the backyard. It was a view I'd seen countless times before, yet something about it felt different today. My eyes drifted to the neighbor's yard, where Sam was tinkering with his car. Sam had been a fixture in the neighborhood for years, but I'd only recently begun to notice him. Or perhaps it wasn't so much him as it was the way he made me feel. A strange warmth that spread through me whenever our paths crossed. He was charming in an easy, effortless way, the kind of man who always seemed to have time for a quick chat or a helping hand. Later that afternoon, I heard the unmistakable sound of a knock on the back door. When I opened it, there he was, holding a pair of pliers in one hand and a sheepish smile on his face. "Hey, thought I'd check on that gate hinge for you," he said, nodding toward the backyard. "It's been squeaking like crazy." I hesitated, knowing I should refuse, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped aside, letting him in. Sam brushed past me, his presence filling the small kitchen. The faint scent of cedar wood and something clean lingered in the air as he moved to the patio door. "I won't take long," he said over his shoulder, already inspecting the offending hinge. I watched him work, the afternoon sun catching the streaks of silver in his dark hair. When he finished, he turned to me with a satisfied grin. "Good as new, shouldn't bother you anymore." I smiled back, feeling my cheeks flush. "Thank you, you didn't have to do that." "It's no trouble," he said, leaning casually against the door frame. "I like helping out." The air between us shifted, becoming heavier, charged. I looked away, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, desperate to break the tension. "Sure," he said, his voice warm and inviting. We sat at the small kitchen table, the space between us feeling both intimate and vast. Conversation flowed easily, as it always did with Sam, but beneath the surface there was something else. A current neither of us dared to acknowledge. As he left, he paused at the door, his hand lingering on the frame. "If you ever need anything, just let me know." I nodded, my throat tight. "I will." The days that followed felt surreal. I found myself looking for excuses to be outside, to catch glimpses of him working in his yard or walking to his car. Each time our eyes met, my heart raced, and I wondered if he felt it too, the unspoken connection growing between us. One evening, a storm rolled in, bringing with it howling winds and driving rain. I was in the kitchen, securing the windows, when a knock startled me. Opening the door, I found Sam standing there, soaked but smiling. "Thought I'd help you bring in the patio furniture," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Together we worked in the rain, struggling against the wind to move the heavy chairs and table. By the time we were done, we were both drenched, our clothes clinging to us. Back in the kitchen, we stood awkwardly, water pooling at our feet. "You should stay until the storm passes," I said, the words escaping before I could think them through. "Thanks," he replied, running a hand through his wet hair. I handed him a towel and tried not to stare as he dried himself off. The kitchen felt smaller than ever, the storm outside amplifying the stillness between us. When he looked at me, his gaze lingered, and I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. "I should go," he said softly, but he didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The space between us disappeared, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was hesitant at first, as if we were testing the waters, but it quickly deepened, years of unspoken longing pouring out in that single moment. When we finally pulled apart, reality crashed down around me. I'm sorry, I stammered, stepping back. He reached for me, his expression a mix of guilt and longing. No, don't apologize. I shouldn't have. I interrupted, shaking my head. We can't do this. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He left soon after, and I was left alone with the storm and the weight of what had just happened. I told myself it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. The next morning, I avoided looking out the window, afraid of what I might see or what I might feel if I saw him. But as the day wore on, my resolve wavered. By late afternoon, I found myself walking to his yard, under the guise of returning a tool he had left behind. When he saw me, his expression softened, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Hey, he said, his voice cautious. Hi, I replied, holding out the tool. You left this. He took it, his fingers brushing mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I've been thinking about you, he admitted, his voice low. I looked away, my cheeks burning. Sam, we can't. I know, he said, stepping closer. But I can't stop. Neither could I. The days following the storm were a blur of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. My thoughts raced, oscillating between guilt, desire, and denial. Every time I tried to focus on something mundane, folding laundry, watering the plants, my mind wandered back to Sam's touch, his scent, and the way he had looked at me as if I was the only person in the world. I avoided the backyard entirely, unwilling to risk seeing him. But of course, life, or fate, had other plans. On a quiet Thursday morning, while I was reading at the kitchen table, a soft knock startled me. I froze, my heart pounding. For a fleeting moment, I thought about ignoring it, pretending I wasn't home. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, got the better of me. When I opened the door, there he was. Sam stood on the porch, holding a small toolbox, his face etched with something between determination and hesitation. Morning, he said, his voice softer than usual. I noticed your fence is sagging a little. Thought I'd come take a look. I blinked at him, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. Sam, you don't have to. I want to, he interrupted, his gaze steady. It'll just take a minute. I stepped aside reluctantly, my stomach in knots. He walked past me into the backyard, his presence stirring something I couldn't quite suppress. As he worked on the fence, I hovered near the patio door, watching him through the glass. He moved with purpose, his hands deft and precise. It was hard not to admire him, and harder still to ignore the pull I felt every time he looked up and caught me staring. Finally, he finished and walked back toward the house, wiping his hands on a rag. All set, he said, stopping at the door. Should hold up fine now. Thank you, I murmured, feeling my cheeks flush. You didn't have to go through the trouble. It wasn't trouble, he replied, his eyes meeting mine. You know that. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped aside to let him in, the silence between us heavier than ever. He lingered near the doorway, his expression unreadable. Can we talk? He asked after a moment, his voice low. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Sam, I don't think... Please. He interrupted, his tone earnest. I need to say this. I nodded reluctantly, motioning for him to sit at the kitchen table. He hesitated before taking a seat, his hands clasped in front of him. I've been trying to stay away, he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. I thought if I gave you space it'd make things easier, but it hasn't. Not for me. My chest tightened as I sat across from him, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Sam? He held up a hand, stopping me. Just let me finish. I know this isn't right. I know it's complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you, and I don't think you can either. I looked away, his words hitting me like a freight train. He was right, of course. I couldn't deny the pull between us, the way my heart raced whenever he was near, but acknowledging it felt. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to say anything, he said, leaning forward slightly. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens, I'm here. I care about you and I. Sam, stop, I interrupted, my voice firmer now. We can't do this. It's not fair. To either of us. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. I know, but that doesn't change how I feel. I stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between us. You should go. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. If that's what you want. It's what I need, I said, though the words felt hollow. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. As he walked to the door, he paused, his hand resting on the frame. I'm not giving up on you, he said quietly. Not yet. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of his words. The next few days were torture. I replayed our conversation over and over, trying to make sense of my feelings. I told myself it was just a fleeting infatuation, a symptom of loneliness and neglect. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was desperate for clarity. My husband was still out of town, his absence both a relief and a burden. I decided to busy myself with errands, hoping the distraction would clear my head. But fate had other plans. As I pulled into the driveway, arms laden with groceries, I saw Sam standing by the fence, his hands in his pockets. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. Hi, he said, his voice tentative. Hi, I replied, my heart pounding. What are you doing here? I wanted to see you, he admitted, stepping closer. To make sure you're okay. I'm fine, I said quickly, though the quiver in my voice betrayed me. You don't look fine, he said, his gaze softening. You look conflicted. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You don't know the half of it. Then tell me, he said, his voice steady. Let me in. I hesitated, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to push him away, to end this once and for all, but another part, the part I tried so hard to ignore, wanted to let him in, to see where this road might lead. Before I could stop myself, I stepped closer, closing the gap between us. He reached for me, his hand brushing mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, my resolve crumbling. And then, without thinking, I kissed him. This time there was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was raw and real, a culmination of weeks of unspoken desire. For a moment the world fell away, leaving only us. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. What now? He whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't walk away. Not yet. The kiss lingered in my mind long after it ended, a moment frozen in time that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Sam and I stood there in the driveway, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. I knew I should pull away, walk back into the house, and lock the door behind me. But I didn't. Instead, I let him take my hand, his touch warm and steady, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. His eyes searched mine, as if silently asking permission to stay in my orbit just a little longer. I gave a small nod, and we walked together toward the backyard, an unspoken understanding passing between us. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn as we sat on the patio steps. Neither of us spoke at first, the silence heavy but not uncomfortable. I stared at the ground, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and longing, while he sat beside me, his presence a quiet reassurance. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" he asked, his tone gentle. "For this," I said, gesturing vaguely between us. "For everything." He exhaled deeply, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You don't need to apologize, not to me." "But I do," I insisted, turning to face him. "This isn't fair. To you, to me, to—" I stopped myself, unable to say my husband's name out loud. The thought of him, away on another business trip, oblivious to what was unfolding in his absence, made my stomach churn. Sam shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. "Look, I know this isn't simple, and I know it's not what you planned or wanted, but I also know how I feel about you. I can't ignore it, and I don't think you can either." I looked at him, his face so open and sincere, and felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "What are we even doing, Sam?" I asked, my voice tinged with desperation. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't want to stop. Do you?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let my gaze wander to the garden, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. A part of me wanted to say yes, to throw caution to the wind and see where this path might lead, but another part, the part tethered to the life I'd built with my husband, held me back. "I don't know," I said finally, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Sam reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "Then let's figure it out together," he said softly. "No pressure, no expectations, just—" For a moment, I let myself imagine what that might look like. Days spent in his easy company, free from the constraints of guilt and obligation. It was a tempting vision, but one I knew could never be real. Not entirely. "I need time," I said, pulling my hand away gently. He nodded, his expression understanding but tinged with disappointment. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." With that, he stood and walked toward the gate, leaving me alone on the patio. I watched him go, my heart aching in ways I didn't fully understand. The days that followed were a study in avoidance. I threw myself into housework, errands, and anything else that might keep my mind occupied. I ignored the texts Sam sent, polite, tentative messages asking how I was, and avoided the backyard entirely. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of his touch, his kiss, his words. It wasn't until the following weekend that I saw him again. I was unloading groceries from the car when I heard his voice behind me. "Need a hand?" I turned to find him standing at the edge of the driveway, his hands in his pockets, his expression cautious. For a moment, I considered telling him to leave, to walk away and let me sort through my feelings on my own. But the words wouldn't come. "Sure," I said instead, stepping aside to let him help. Together, we carried the bags into the kitchen, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. Once everything was put away, I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed over my chest. "Sam, we need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. He nodded, pulling out a chair at the table and sitting down. I joined him, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. Whatever this is between us, it has to stop," I said, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I can't do this. I can't betray—" "You don't have to say it," he interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "I know what's at stake, and I get it, I do. But don't pretend this doesn't mean anything to you. Don't pretend it's just me." I opened my mouth to argue but stopped, the words dying on my lips. He was right, of course. I couldn't deny the connection we shared, no matter how much I wanted to. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice cracking. I feel like I'm being torn in two." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Then don't make any decisions right now," he said. "Just let yourself feel, let yourself be." I stared at him, the sincerity in his eyes unraveling the carefully constructed walls I'd built around my heart. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe, to let go of the constant push and pull of guilt and desire. "Okay," I said finally, the words small but filled with promise. Sam squeezed my hand, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay," he echoed. In that moment, I knew the road ahead would be anything but easy, but for the first time I felt a glimmer of clarity, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward. The next few days felt like walking a tightrope stretched between two worlds. On one side was the life I'd built with my husband, the predictable routines, the shared history, and the quiet comfort of familiarity. On the other was the undeniable pull I felt toward Sam, a connection that was raw, exhilarating, and completely out of control. I avoided my husband's calls more than usual, claiming exhaustion or busy work whenever he tried to catch up. I hated myself for the lies, but I couldn't bring myself to face him, not when my thoughts were consumed by someone else. My guilt grew heavier with each passing day, and yet, every time I saw Sam's messages on my phone, my heart would skip a beat. Then, late one evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, there was a knock at the door. My stomach flipped. It was too late for a neighborly visit, and I already knew who it would be. I hesitated, debating whether to pretend I wasn't home, but the knock came again, softer this time. When I opened it, Sam was standing on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. His expression was unreadable, but his presence filled the small space between us, sending a jolt through me. "Hi," he said simply, his voice low. "Sam, it's late," I replied, trying to sound composed. "Is everything okay?" "I couldn't stay away," he admitted, his gaze steady but vulnerable. "I've been trying to give you space, but I just needed to see you." My heart sank and soared all at once. "You can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But I also know how I feel about you, and I think you feel the same." I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the edge of the door. "Sam, this isn't fair. Not to my husband, not to us." His eyes softened, and he reached out to gently touch my hand. "I'm not asking for fair," he said quietly. "I'm asking for honest. Can you look me in the eye and tell me you don't want this?" My breath hitched, the weight of his words crashing over me. I wanted to say it, to end this once and for all, but the truth was staring me in the face, undeniable and unrelenting. "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The tension between us reached a breaking point, and before I could stop myself, I stepped back, opening the door wider. He hesitated for a moment, as if giving me one last chance to change my mind. But when I didn't, he stepped inside. The air in the living room felt charged as we stood there, inches apart, the unspoken words hanging heavily between us. My heart raced as he raised a hand to gently cut my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "Tell me to leave?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "If you don't want this, just say the word." But I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into his touch, the warmth of his palm grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. He took that as his answer, and before I could think, his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow, deliberate, and all-consuming. It wasn't like the hurried, guilt-ridden moments we'd shared before. This was something deeper, something that felt terrifyingly real. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer as I tangled my fingers in his hair, surrendering to the storm of emotion swirling inside me. We moved as if on instinct, our breaths mingling as we found ourselves on the couch. His touch was electric, igniting parts of me I thought had long since gone numb. Every kiss, every caress felt like a revelation, peeling away layers of doubt and fear until there was nothing left but raw, unfiltered desire. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not as a wife or a neighbor or someone's responsibility, but as a woman. Sam didn't just look at me, he saw me, every part of me, and accepted it without hesitation. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. As the night wore on, we lay, tangled together on the couch, the room bathed in the soft glow of a forgotten lamp. I traced circles on his chest, my thoughts a jumble of what-ifs and now-whats. Sam ran a hand through my hair, his expression tender but searching. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the quiet. I nodded, though the truth was far more complicated. "I don't know what happens next," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," he said, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "But I'm here. Whatever you decide, I'm here." His words hung in the air, a promise I wasn't sure I deserved. As I lay there, cocooned in his warmth, reality began to seep back in. The weight of what we'd done loomed over me, threatening to crush the fragile happiness I'd found in his arms. I knew this couldn't last. No matter how much I wanted it to, no matter how much I felt for him, the life I'd built with my husband couldn't simply be erased. But for now, in this stolen moment, I allowed myself to hold on, to feel something real, even if it was fleeting. By the time dawn began to creep through the curtains, we both knew it was time. Sam kissed me gently, his touch lingering before he pulled away. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice tinged with sadness, "and think about what you want, not just for him or me, for you." I watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. As the house settled into silence once more, I sank onto the couch, the weight of my choices pressing heavily on my chest. For the first time, I truly understood the cost of what we'd done, and yet I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The morning after, the house felt eerily quiet, almost too still. The events of the previous night clung to me like a second skin, impossible to shake. I lingered in the kitchen, sipping coffee that had gone cold long before I finished it, my thoughts spiraling in endless loops of guilt, longing, and confusion. I knew what I'd done, I knew what it meant, and yet part of me couldn't bring myself to regret it. Sam had awakened something in me that I thought had been lost, something that hadn't been nurtured in years. But what did that mean for the life I had built? For the man who trusted me implicitly, who called me every night from thousands of miles away to tell me he missed me? I glanced at my phone, sitting innocuously on the countertop. A notification blinked. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I couldn't bring myself to reply, much less call. How could I face him when I was unraveling inside? By midday, I was pacing the house, the walls feeling as though they were closing in on me. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed too bright, too cheerful, mocking the storm raging within me. I thought about texting Sam, about asking him to come over, but I stopped myself. I couldn't keep using him as a lifeline when I didn't even know what I wanted. That afternoon, I decided to go for a drive. Anywhere but here, I thought, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. The open road seemed like the only place where I could think clearly. I didn't have a destination in mind, but the rhythmic hum of the engine and the blur of the passing scenery gave me a sense of calm I desperately needed. Before I knew it, I was parked at the edge of a park on the other side of town. It was quiet, with only a few joggers and families enjoying the early afternoon. I found a bench under a sprawling oak tree and sat down, my head in my hands. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." I looked up, startled, to see Sam standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. For a moment, I thought I was imagining him, but the look of concern on his face was all too real. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He shrugged, taking a hesitant step closer. "I come here sometimes. Helps me think." He paused, his gaze searching mine. "Didn't expect to see you, though." I smiled faintly, though it didn't reach my eyes. I needed to get out of the house. He sat beside me, leaving a respectful distance between us. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence filled only by the rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of children. "I'm sorry if I've made things harder for you," he said eventually, his voice low. "That was never my intention." I turned to him, startled. "You didn't force me to do anything, Sam. I made my choices. This is on me, too." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I just want you to know I care about you. Whatever you decide, whatever happens, that won't change." His words sent a pang through my chest, and I looked away, blinking back the tears threatening to spill. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I feel like I'm being torn apart." "You don't have to decide everything right now," he said gently. "Take it one step at a time." I let his words settle over me, their simplicity a balm to my frazzled nerves. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. We sat there in companionable silence, the weight of the world momentarily lifted. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, reality came rushing back. I couldn't stay in this liminal space forever, caught between two lives. Eventually, I'd have to make a choice. When we parted ways, Sam hugged me tightly, his embrace warm and steady. "Take care of yourself," he said softly before walking away. I drove home with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The house felt quieter than ever, but instead of letting it consume me, I grabbed my phone and dialed my husband's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Hey, love," he said. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." "I'm sorry," I replied, my voice shaky but determined. "It's been a lot lately." "I understand," he said, his tone gentle. "Work's been crazy, but I'll be home in a few days. Maybe we can spend some time together, just the two of us." The thought of him coming home sent a pang of anxiety through me, but I forced myself to nod, even though he couldn't see it. "I'd like that." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the living room, my thoughts swirling. The next few days would be crucial, time to decide what kind of life I wanted and what I was willing to do to make it happen. But for now, I allowed myself one small mercy, the knowledge that no matter how messy or complicated things might get, I wasn't completely lost. Not yet. The days leading up to my husband's return passed in a haze of restless anticipation. I oscillated between preparing myself for his arrival and grappling with the lingering feelings for Sam. Every moment felt like a countdown to a confrontation I wasn't ready for, yet I knew it was inevitable. I busied myself with cleaning the house, scrubbing every surface until my hands ached, as if somehow I could cleanse the guilt that clung to me. Each time I passed the window and caught a glimpse of Sam's house, my stomach twisted into knots. He hadn't texted since we'd parted at the park, and though I told myself it was for the best, a small part of me missed him terribly. The night before my husband's flight home, I found myself sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at the framed photo on the nightstand. It was taken on our honeymoon, both of us grinning, arms wrapped around each other with the ocean stretching out behind us. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger, the weight of the life we'd built together pressing heavily on my chest. I loved him, I knew I did, but was love enough to bridge the growing chasm between us? Could we ever go back to the way things were before the distance, the silence, and the secret? Sleep eluded me that night, and I was still awake when the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains. I got up, made a pot of coffee, and tried to steady myself for the day ahead. He would be home by evening, and I had no idea how I was going to face him. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take the suffocating stillness of the house any longer. I grabbed my jacket and decided to take a walk. The crisp autumn air was a welcome relief, and I let the steady rhythm of my steps clear my mind. I hadn't planned to pass by Sam's house, but somehow I found myself on his street. His car was parked in the driveway, and I hesitated, my heart pounding. I told myself to keep walking, to let him be, but before I could convince myself otherwise, Sam stepped outside, his expression softening when he saw me. "Hey," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "Hi," I replied, suddenly unsure of why I was there. "Everything okay?" he asked, stepping closer. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "My husband's coming home tonight." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he gestured toward the porch. "Do you want to sit for a minute?" I hesitated, then nodded, following him to the steps. We sat side by side, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. After a moment, he broke it. "Have you figured out what you want yet?" he asked gently. I shook my head, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I don't know, Sam. I don't know how to untangle everything. I feel like I'm drowning." He reached out and covered my hand with his, the warmth of his touch grounding me. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, "but you deserve to be happy, whatever that looks like." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I blinked back tears. "I don't even know what that means anymore," I admitted, my voice cracking. "You will," he said, his tone steady. "Just give yourself time." We sat there for a while longer, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. Eventually I stood, brushing off my jeans. "I should go," I said softly. "I need to get ready for tonight." He nodded, standing as well. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." I managed a small smile before turning to leave. As I walked back home, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo forever. At some point, I would have to make a choice. That evening, as I waited for my husband's car to pull into the driveway, my nerves were frayed. I'd changed outfits 3 times, cleaned the kitchen twice, and checked my reflection in the mirror more times than I cared to admit. When I finally heard the crunch of tires on the gravel, my stomach dropped. He walked through the door, suitcase in hand, looking tired but happy to be home. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, dropping his bag and pulling me into a hug. I froze for a moment, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, but then I hugged him back, the familiarity of his embrace both comforting and suffocating. "I missed you," he said, his voice muffled against my hair. "I missed you too," I replied, though the words felt hollow. We spent the evening catching up, the conversation light and easy. I forced myself to smile, to laugh at his stories, to pretend that everything was fine. But inside, I felt like I was falling apart. Later, as we lay in bed, his arm draped across my waist, I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The reality of what I'd done, of the decisions I would soon have to make, loomed over me like a storm cloud. For now, I told myself, I could hold on to this moment of quiet. But I knew it wouldn't last. Sooner or later, the truth would come to light, and when it did, there would be no turning back. The moment my husband stepped through the door, suitcase in hand and a tired but genuine smile on his face, I felt the weight of my actions bearing down on me like never before. The kiss on my cheek, his soft "I missed you," and the way he dropped his bag to embrace me, all of it felt too normal, too loving, too undeserved. I clung to him for a moment longer than usual, guilt and regret mingling in a way that made it hard to breathe. That evening, as we sat together at the dinner table, I could barely meet his eyes. He recounted stories from his trip, laughing about small mishaps and sharing updates about his colleagues. I nodded along, forcing a smile here and there, but my mind was elsewhere. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, reminded me of the trust I'd shattered. The dinner stretched on endlessly, every second a battle to maintain my composure. After the dishes were cleared and the house settled into its usual evening rhythm, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I found him in the living room, scrolling through his phone, his feet propped up on the coffee table. My heart pounded as I stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment, gathering the courage to do what needed to be done. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, concern flickering across his face. "Of course," he said, setting his phone aside and sitting up straighter. What's on your mind?" I sat down on the edge of the couch, my hands trembling as I clasped them together in my lap. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, my eyes fixed on the floor as I struggled to find the right words. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice wavering. "Something I've been hiding from you." His brows knit together and he leaned forward slightly, his expression a mix of confusion and worry. "What is it?" he asked gently. The words felt like razor blades in my throat, cutting me open as I forced them out. "While you've been away, I've been seeing someone else." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and searching, as he tried to process what I'd just said. "What do you mean?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but sharp. I took a shaky breath, my hands twisting together in my lap. "There's a man, Sam, our neighbor. It started as nothing, just conversations, but it turned into something more." His face paled, his jaw tightening as he leaned back against the couch. "How long?" he asked, his tone clipped. I hesitated, my chest tightening. "A few weeks." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "A few weeks?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "I was gone for work, doing everything I could to provide for us, and you—" He stopped, his words catching in his throat. "Why, Ham? Why would you do this?" Tears blurred my vision as I finally looked at him, my heart breaking at the pain etched across his face. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "I was lonely. I felt invisible, and Sam, he made me feel seen, like I mattered." "And I didn't?" he snapped, his voice rising. "I've been working my ass off for this family, for us, and you're telling me you felt invisible?" "It's not just about you being gone," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "It's about how distant we've been, even when you're here. It's about how I've felt like I've been drowning and I didn't know how to tell you." He stood abruptly, pacing the room, his hands raking through his hair. "So instead of talking to me, you turned to him? You let him into our lives, into our marriage?" "I made a mistake," I said, my voice breaking. "A terrible, unforgivable mistake. But it's not because I don't love you. I do. I've always—" He stopped, his eyes blazing as he stared at me. "Do you love him?" he demanded. "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "I care about him, but I don't love him. I love you." He scoffed, his expression a mix of anger and devastation. "Funny way of showing it," he muttered, his voice dripping with bitterness. The silence that followed was suffocating. He sat down heavily in the armchair, his head in his hands, as he tried to make sense of what I'd just told him. I wanted to reach out to him, to take his hand, to beg for his forgiveness, but I didn't. I couldn't. Not when I'd caused this. Finally, he looked up, his eyes red and glassy. "I don't know what to do with this," he said, his voice hollow. "I don't know how to move past it." "I'll do whatever it takes," I said, my words tumbling out in desperation. Therapy, counseling, anything. I want to fix this. I want to fix us. He shook his head slowly, his expression weary. I need time, he said. I need to figure out if this is even something I can forgive. I understand, I said softly, tears streaming down my face. Take all the time you need. I want you to know how sorry I am. For everything. He stood again, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm going to stay at a hotel for a few days, he said. I need space. I nodded, my heart breaking as I watched him grab his keys and head for the door. He paused for a moment, his hand on the doorknob before turning back to look at me. I loved you, he said quietly. I still do, but right now, I don't know if that's enough. And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the silent house. I sank onto the couch, the weight of his words crushing me. For the first time, I truly understood the magnitude of what I'd done, the pain I'd caused, the trust I'd broken, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. I didn't know if we could find our way back to each other, or if this was the end of the life we'd built together. All I knew was that I had to face the consequences of my choices, no matter how painful they might be. When my husband returned from his short stay at the hotel, the air in the house was heavy with tension. The days he had been gone had stretched endlessly, giving me too much time to think, to dissect my actions and their consequences. I was desperate to talk to him, to salvage what I could of our marriage, but I also feared what his decision might be. Would he come back ready to work through this, or would this be the beginning of the end? The sound of his car pulling into the driveway sent a wave of anxiety rippling through me. I stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as I heard the front door open and close. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, as he approached. When he appeared in the doorway, his expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm brewing inside him. "Hi," I said softly, unsure of how else to begin. "Hi," he replied, his voice neutral. The silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive. Finally, he leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. "We need to talk." I nodded, gesturing toward the table. "Do you want to sit?" He shook his head. "No, I'd rather stay." I swallowed hard, clasping my hands together to keep them from shaking. "Okay. I've been thinking a lot these past few days," he began, his tone measured, "trying to make sense of all this, trying to figure out where we go from here, if we even can." "I want to fix this," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes." He held up a hand, stopping me. "I'm not sure it's that simple. You didn't just break my trust. You broke something fundamental between us, something I'm not sure we can ever get back." The words hit me like a blow and I felt my knees weaken. "I know I hurt you," I said, tears welling in my eyes, "and I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I love you, and I want to fight for us." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You say you love me, but you turned to someone else the moment things got hard. Do you even realize how much that hurts? How much it feels like I failed you as a husband?" "You didn't fail me," I said quickly, stepping closer. "This wasn't your fault. I made a terrible choice, but it wasn't because of anything you did." "Then why?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Why him? Why couldn't you come to me?" I hesitated, the truth catching in my throat. "I felt lonely," I admitted finally, my voice breaking. "I felt invisible. You were always gone, and even when you were here, it felt like you weren't. Sam, he made me feel seen." His jaw clenched and he looked away, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Do you love him?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I said firmly. "I care about him, but I don't love him." "I love you." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You have a strange way of showing it. I know, I said, tears streaming down my face. I know I betrayed you, and I hate myself for it, but I'm standing here now telling you the truth because I want to make this right. Please, give me a chance to prove that I can. He turned back to me, his eyes hard. And how do I know this won't happen again? How do I know you won't turn to someone else the next time you feel lonely or unseen? You don't, I admitted, my voice trembling. But I'm willing to do the work to make sure it doesn't. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes, I want to be better for you, for us. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if I can do this, he said quietly. I don't know if I can move past this. My heart sank, and I took a step closer, desperate to bridge the gap between us. Please, I said, my voice breaking. Don't give up on us. Don't give up on me. I need time, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. I can't make any promises right now. I need to figure out if I can even forgive them. I understand, I said softly, though the words felt hollow. Take all the time you need. He nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment before he turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway felt like the closing of a door I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to reopen. That night, I lay in bed alone, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his words pressing heavily on my chest. I knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. He hadn't left for good. He was still here, still considering whether we could rebuild what I had broken. And for now, that was enough. It had to be. The morning after my husband returned home, I awoke with a sense of unease that refused to fade. He was already up, whistling softly in the kitchen as he prepared breakfast, a habit I had once found endearing, but now only deepened my guilt. I stayed in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the courage to face him. When I finally joined him, he greeted me with a warm smile, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of me. Good morning, love, he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. Good morning, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The weight of his affection, so freely given, felt unbearable. As we ate, he chatted about work, upcoming travel plans, and a possible vacation he wanted to plan for us. I nodded along, offering the occasional, that sounds nice, or we'll see, but my mind was elsewhere. The life he was so eager to maintain felt like a cage, one I had willingly stepped into but now longed to escape. Later, as he packed his bag for the gym, I stood by the window, staring at Sam's house. The memories of our time together felt like a vice tightening around my chest. I knew I couldn't keep living this double life. The truth, messy and painful as it was, needed to come out. When my husband left, I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I scrolled through my phone. I opened a blank message to Sam, typing and deleting words that felt inadequate. Finally, I settled on something simple. His reply came almost immediately. Of course. When? Within minutes, Sam was at my back door, his face a mixture of concern and anticipation. I let him in, my heart pounding as I gestured for him to sit. The kitchen, once a space of comfort, now felt suffocating. What's going on? He asked gently, his eyes searching mine. I sat across from him, clasping my hands together tightly. I need to tell you something, I began, my voice shaky. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep living in this in-between. His expression softened, though a flicker of sadness crossed his face. I understand, he said quietly. Whatever you need. I don't know how I got here, I continued, the words spilling out in a rush. I don't know how I let things get so complicated, so messy, but I can't keep lying to myself or to him. Sam nodded, his gaze steady but tinged with resignation. Do you know what you want? I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. I think so, I said finally. I think I need to try to fix things with him, to see if there's still something. His jaw tightened, but he nodded again. I want you to be happy, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it, even if it's not with me. Tears welled in my eyes as I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. You've shown me something I didn't know I needed, I said, my voice breaking. You reminded me what it feels like to be seen, to be cared for. I'll never forget that. He squeezed my hand gently before letting go. You deserve to feel that every day, he said. I hope you find it. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of goodbye hanging heavily between us. Finally, Sam stood, his movements deliberate. Take care of yourself, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You too, I replied, my chest aching as I watched him walk to the door. When he was gone, the house felt emptier than ever. I allowed myself a moment to cry, the tears spilling over as the reality of my decision sank in. I had chosen my husband, my marriage, but it felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and by the time my husband returned from the gym, I had resolved to tell him the truth. I couldn't build a future on lies, no matter how much it might hurt in the short term. That evening, as we sat together in the living room, I turned to him, my heart pounding. We need to talk, I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his brow furrowing. I took a deep breath, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. I haven't been honest with you, I began, the words catching in my throat. While you've been away, I've been spending time with someone else. His face fell, the color draining from his cheeks. What do you mean? He asked, his voice strained. I looked down, unable to meet his eyes. There's a neighbor, Sam. It started as nothing, a conversation here and there, but it turned into something more. The silence that followed was deafening. When I finally looked up, his expression was a mix of shock, hurt, and anger. Who went? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I admitted, my tears spilling over. I was lonely, I felt invisible, and Sam, he made me feel seen. He stood, pacing the room as he tried to process my words. Do you love him? He asked, his tone sharp. No, I said quickly, shaking my head. I care about him, but I love you. I always have. He stopped, turning to face me, his eyes glistening. Then why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me you felt this way? I tried, I said, my voice breaking, but you were always gone, always busy. I didn't know how to reach you. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. For a long time, neither of us spoke, the weight of my confession hanging heavily between us. Finally, he looked up, his expression weary but determined. I need time, he said. I don't know what this means for us, but I need time to figure it out. I nodded, my heart heavy with regret. Take all the time you need, I said softly. I'm sorry. For everything. As he left the room, the house felt impossibly quiet. I knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other, or if not, find a way to move forward, separately, but with honesty. The morning felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself knew what was coming. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before. My husband's suitcase stood by the door, a silent testament to the conversation we'd had the night before. After weeks of trying, of therapy sessions that felt like walking on glass, and countless nights of uneasy silence, he had decided to leave, for now, to clear his head. The sound of his footsteps broke my thoughts, and I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his expression guarded but weary. He was dressed casually, his hair slightly mussed as though he hadn't slept much. Neither had I. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, though his eyes softened for a moment. "I think it's what we both need," he said. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." I bit my lip, my chest tightening. "And if you don't come back?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know that right now, I can't stay." The words cut deeper than I expected, even though I'd known they were coming. I stood, my hands trembling slightly as I moved toward him. "I know I've made this impossible for you," I said, my voice cracking. "But I want you to know that I'm still here. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here." He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if trying to memorize my face. "I don't want you to wait for me," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I don't know where this road will lead, and it's not fair to ask you to put your life on hold." "It's my choice," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I owe you that much." A flicker of something, gratitude maybe, crossed his face, but he didn't argue. Instead, he reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and familiar, but tinged with a sadness that made my throat tighten. "I love you," he said softly. "I always have. But love doesn't always fix everything." "I know," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. "But it's a start." He nodded, releasing my hand as he turned to grab his suitcase. I followed him to the door, my chest aching with every step. When he paused at the threshold, I thought he might turn back, say something that would change everything. But he didn't. He stepped outside, the crisp morning air rushing in behind him. As he loaded his suitcase into the car, I stood in the doorway, hugging myself against the cold. He hesitated before opening the driver's side door, glancing back at me one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice carrying a tenderness that made my heart ache. "You too?" I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. And then he was gone. The car disappeared down the street, leaving me standing alone in the doorway, the weight of his absence settling over me like a blanket of grief. I closed the door slowly, leaning against it as the tears finally came, hot and unstoppable. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. I wandered into the living room, aimless, my mind a whirlwind of memories and regrets. That's when I noticed it, a small envelope sitting on the coffee table, my name written on the front in his familiar handwriting. With shaking hands, I opened it, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. His words were simple, but they hit me like a tidal wave. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. You're stronger than you think, and no matter where this journey takes us, I'll always be grateful for the life we shared. Be kind to yourself, your name. You deserve that much and more. Love." I sank onto the couch, clutching the note as fresh tears spilled over. It wasn't the ending I wanted, but it wasn't a complete goodbye either. It was something in between, a farewell wrapped in hope, in uncertainty, in the possibility of someday. As I sat there, the weight in my chest began to ease, just slightly. I didn't know what the future would bring, whether he would come back or if I would find the strength to move on without him, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to rewrite this story. For both of us. I sat in the quiet house, the envelope still clutched in my hands. His words lingered in the air, bittersweet and heavy with meaning. The emptiness around me was palpable, yet there was an odd sense of clarity too, a realization that life wouldn't end here, even if this chapter had. I walked to the window, looking out at the now empty driveway. The morning sunlight bathed the street in a soft glow, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe deeply. This wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it wasn't the end of me. As I folded the note and placed it in a drawer, I whispered softly to the room, "I'll be okay." It wasn't a declaration of certainty, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was enough.